Good day, everyone. My name's Dr. Garrett Barnwell. I'm a clinical psychologist and community psychology practitioner. I'm also a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Johannesburg Faculty of Humanities. Today, I want to share some of my thoughts with you about decoloniality, epistemic justice, and climate psychology. I'll focus first on climate change and some of the dynamics of coloniality that I think are important to consider. Then I'll highlight more at a community psychology level, where I see an entry point for psychology to play a meaningful role in the climate justice struggle. And I'll share one or two examples just of my experience, just to also say that these are some preliminary thoughts that I have, and it's a kind of continuously evolving process. Where we are today in the climate psychology, I think, is also moving more towards differences. So also being able to understand where we're from, the context, because in the very near future, and what we experience today, is that we're already impacted by climate change, and therefore the societies that we are part of, the specificities really do matter. So in my title, I specifically say views from below, here being South Africa. So we've been graced very recently by Garth Stevens and Christopher Son's new book, Decoloniality and Epistemic Justice in Contemporary Community Psychology. And it's really worth reading. And then what they say is decolonial theory is much more broadly and paradigmatically directed towards understanding the historic ontological effects of coloniality as a system on contemporary social arrangements and subjects today. In terms of climate psychology, here what I think is important is being able to understand the experiences of being within history in relationship to these ongoing experiences of coloniality and how they're reproduced today. I'll just share a few thoughts on this and highlight why I think it's important in our thinking. So to do this, I want to share this picture with you, because I think that it describes some of the logic of decolonial theory quite well. So the Peruvian sociologist Anibal Quijano differentiated between colonialism and coloniality, seeing colonialism as the administrations that have largely been dismantled, while coloniality is still around us and at large. It's the reproduction of different ideas, ways of being in the world, and power that is reflected in our institutions of today and retain this kind of hegemony to some extent of whiteness and Eurocentrism. So here in this image, you see a European figure enunciating a certain pathway. And what Mignolo says is this kind of logic that's enunciated is this pathway of modernity that's supposed to bring prosperity and progress for the world, but is actually, in fact, being characterized by extreme forms of violence in and around the global south and the souths of the north. And in many extents, so if you think about the climate crisis, to many extents, it's underpinned by this logic of coloniality, where we are converting life on Earth into a resource for this extractive system. So importantly, in terms of people being able to adapt to the climate crisis and being able to weather the greater shocks that are going to take place. The history of colonialism has led today to a massively unequal world, where 73% of the world's income is in the global north, while 86% of the world's population is in the global south. We also know from recent reports, so for instance, there's a report by Save the Tauran that says that Tauran in the global south are experiencing and will experience more environmental adversities as a result of climate change to those that were born in 1960. So it's both global, but also across generations where there's this sense of climate injustice. Also, those youth of today bear the brunt of kind of managing the decisions, adapting to the climate crisis compared to those from before. So decolonial theory, I think importantly here, is, and reflected in this previous map, is these zones of being and non-being that are created. So this image is adapted by Norval Gaceni, that speaks to the Martinican psychiatrist, the late Martinican psychiatrist Frans Fanon's ideas, where he speaks about the zone of being and non-being in the world that is separated by these colonial categories. So within the zone of non-being is this Eurocentric, normative, patriarchal kind of logic that claims totality of thought. And within the zone of non-being are other knowledges, ways of knowing and being in the world that are considered inferior or made to be invisible. I've added here some thoughts around climate change. So those who find themselves in the zone of being or privilege have better material resources to adapt to the climate crisis, hold more negotiating power and ideological power, while those that are considered, because of this logic, as inferior or invisible, are highly vulnerable to climate change, have the least material power to adapt, and continue to face epistemic violence on the front lines, specifically land, environmental defenders, and residents that are on the front lines of these zones of non-being. And we know that these aren't just ideas. Frans Fanon showed in his work how they are geographically based. So also the author Macarenas Gomez Barres speaks about extractive zones. So how epistemic territories all around the world have been converted into these zones for extraction for the global north. And I like what Gomez Barres also says in her book, is that these extractive zones also points of resistance. And this is what I'll speak to more as we move forward. So now to take it down a level, from my experiences here in South Africa, and to also kind of share, I see, and also reflecting on Gar Stevens and Christopher Son's kind of work that they've collected, or their edited volume, I see in terms of the climate crisis, epistemic injustice and justice has been an entry point for community psychologists and psychologists more broadly. So what do I see here? And I'll share example later. So epistemic violence is this silencing, inferiorizing, or invisibilizing certain knowledge, ways of being in the world. So what we see is that extractive industries today are often the new colonial outposts in the global south. So often in the decisions that are made around mining or fossil fuel industries, communities are excluded from decisions. They're silenced either through threats or such as litigation against public participation or physical violence. So as we know, 2020 had the highest amount of killings of land and environmental defenders compared to previous years. Also, it's the distrust that is created towards communities by how these decisions are framed. It's also the devaluing of certain knowledges or the distortions of meaning. So for instance, if we think about youth climate activists, how in the media, politicians say that, youth are anxious because they are subjected to alarmist material and they should be protected from this material. So devaluing that children and youth are saying, no, we are worried because our leaders we don't see our leaders taking action, for instance. So there's this war of position in some sense when it comes to taking action and creating change where it's needed. And I think the entry point for psychology in terms of this discourse is to show how there's this continued logic of progress, business as usual, that silences, devalues, distorts, distrusts, or excludes basically discontent, whether it be youth, communities on the front lines of new extractive projects and so forth. So I want to share with you a video that's recently been released by Global Witness, where they really emphasize the importance of land and environmental defenders on the front line in terms of the climate justice struggle.
There is a movement of people across the globe who could prove instrumental in tackling the climate crisis and achieving environmental justice. They are the communities taking local action to stop mining, agribusiness, and other industries causing environmental destruction. They are land and environmental defenders. Across the world, many communities live and work on the front line of the devastating impacts of the climate crisis, facing floods, forest fires, displacement, and destruction of homes. Indigenous communities are particularly at risk, their skills in land and water management having preserved fragile ecosystems and species for centuries. But anyone can become a land and environmental defender in any part of the world. The Waorani indigenous community in Ecuador, who championed and won a landmark case to protect the Amazon rainforest from oil and gas exploitation, are defenders. Parents and grandparents who came together in the Philippines to stop a coal power plant from polluting their air and displacing them from their homes are defenders. Activists in rural northern England who decided to protest against a large shale gas operation ruining the landscape are defenders. However, many of these defenders face criminalization, violence, and murder. Since the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, nearly 800 defenders have been killed, while others have lost homes and livelihoods, face orchestrated smear campaigns, and are labeled terrorists. In 2019, the United Nations formally recognized the role of defenders in environmental protection, And a recent global study showed that in 11% of environmental conflicts, defenders contributed to halting environmentally destructive projects. If defenders are able to achieve this against all the odds, imagine what they could do without threat of criminalization or attacks. If we want to avert the climate disaster and deliver real climate justice, governments and businesses must protect these land and environmental defenders and ensure their voices are heard. Find out more. globalwitness.org/defenders.
So I think all around the world, there's these land and environmental justice struggles that play a very important part in terms of combating and fighting ongoing climate change and the coloniality, the dynamics of coloniality that underpin it, that place not only these frontline communities in harm's way, but also the world because of the extreme impacts of climate change. And I see psychology's or a entry point in terms of describing this process, describing how communities are being affected, but also how they're being excluded, threatened, how meanings are distorted, and so forth. But also, importantly, to do so for something, so for the flourishing of other life. So Son and Stephen say, the pursuit of epistemic justice is about expanding our ecology of knowledge to decenter, unlink, retrieve, and recenter ways of knowing, doing, and being that have been violently devalued and omitted through the coloniality of power, and that continue to be contested at the borders. So specifically here, I think these extractive zones and points that are found all over the world of the colonial matrix that characterizes contemporary planetary entanglements. So it's not only an opportunity for climate crisis, but also opportunity for this decolonial thinking to emerge at these borderlands that Stevens and some speak about. So here I want to share just briefly 3 examples from South Africa. So the first example is the documentation process that's related to public participation processes in South Africa in a part of the country called Limpopo. And it's regarding the construction of a special economic zone that will be financed by the Chinese. We still see now what will happen because of the call that the Chinese made in terms of de-investing in coal power, the building, but we don't know if that extends to financing. But basically, what is proposed is this really amazing project involving coal power stations, metallurgic center that will support surrounding extractive economies for jobs and other things. What if we look at this logic of progress, what we see underpinning it is actually quite concerning. So ecologically, it has a huge impact. So South Africa is a water-scarce region and is already, according to the IPCC 2021 report, is being affected by increased precipitation and drying conditions. So this project will consume 250 million liters of water per day, according to some of the expert reports that were released in relationship to the project. It will also amount to 115 tons of hazardous and industrial waste per day. And in terms of CO2, we're looking at a carbon bomb of 34 million tons per year. So communities in and around the area are significantly concerned. However, what we've seen is through the process, public participation process, is that some members of the community have been excluded in different ways, and also some knowledges about the area haven't been included. So, for instance, concerns over burial sites, traditional belief systems related to these burial sites, and the removal of indigenous vegetation, and concerns over water resources. What has been interesting, I think, as the first example where psychology has played a role is in terms of the people's eco-mapping hearing. So from this process of feeling unheard, unseen, and excluded, the people's eco-mapping hearings came about, which was supported by Earthlife Africa and facilitated by members of the possibly affected community and Tsomola Mupo, a grassroots community organization. And what they did was, over a couple of days, hold community meetings about what do people see as the main impacts of this. And what they did was they rooted in histories of apartheid, racial segregation, land dispossession, showed how this still causes distress today, and how the process itself causes significant psychological distress. My role in the process, I was invited as an observer to this hearing, and a report of mine has been submitted for the formal environmental impact assessment to bring to light some of the concerns that haven't been articulated in the process. So this is just one kind of strategy in terms of contesting this logic that stands to have incredibly concerning impacts on local communities. Maybe also just, let me continue. Example 2, which has been interesting, is also a process of documentation, but histories of land dispossession in other areas that have been used for the protection of sacred sites that have come under also threats of mining, for instance. But this is a bit the fall as well. So it's not only documenting the potential harm, but it's documentation for the potential protection of certain places. What I like about these reports that I've been using is it links distress not only to the potential of hazards, but it links distress to these effective bonds to place, and also thinks about these places as kind of epistemic territories. So the distress I've been articulating it is that the distress comes from this epistemic violence, the kind of displacement, the threats of losing knowledge and ways of being in the world that are non-consensual. Lastly, I just want to highlight there's other kind of documenting or reports that I've been involved with. So for instance, recently we released a report that was commissioned by the Centre for Environmental Rights that documents basically the impacts of climate change on the population in South Africa. This expert report has been used with a number of other expert reports in basically an ongoing process to contest South Africa's continued investment in coal and new purchases or new investments being made in coal industries. So I can speak about this more in the panel, but here I think, so the entry point is in terms of, in this report at least, is the impacts of climate change, but also highlighting the sense of institutional betrayal that youth face and communities face in knowing that there's an issue but action not being taken. So here again, you see not only the documentation of effective knowledge, so this distress being actually an important source of knowledge, but also the epistemic violence of the sense of institutional betrayal not being heard, not being seen, action not being taken to avert harm. So these are just 3 examples, and I hope that I've done a job of stimulating some thoughts and discussion for the panel. These are just some of the references that I mentioned, and thank you very much.